The first sign was the silence. I had been working my shift in Manufactorum Delta 7, calibrating the blessed machine spirits of the ammunition presses, when I noticed that the usual hymnal chanting from the adjoining assembly hall had stopped. Just stopped. The absence of sound was more unsettling than any alarm could have been. In the Imperium, silence meant only one thing: someone was watching. My name is Marcus Valdrin, designation 44 Theta 339, and until 17 hours ago, I was a loyal servant of the Emperor. I had spent 12 years maintaining the sacred machinery that produced bolter rounds for the Astra Militarum. I knew every prayer circuit, every incantation needed to appease the machine spirits. My hands bore the sacred oils of benediction. My voice had recited 10,000 litanies of function. I had never missed a devotional, never failed to genuflect before the shrine of the Omnissiah at shift change, never questioned an order from my supervisors. My loyalty was unquestionable, or so I thought. The warning signs had been there for weeks, though I hadn't recognized them at the time. Servo skulls lingering longer than usual in my work area. Colleagues who had grown suddenly distant, their conversations stopping when I approached. The shift supervisor, Adept Cornelius, asking seemingly innocent questions about my thoughts on imperial doctrine during our regular productivity meetings. Questions that seemed casual but were delivered with the precise diction of someone following a script. I should have known then. In the Imperium, there are no casual questions about faith. Every word is weighed, every response analyzed for signs of deviation from orthodox thought. But I had been naive enough to believe that my record spoke for itself, that 12 years of faithful service would shield me from suspicion. The servo skull found me first. It drifted through the industrial haze of the Manufactorum floor, its brass-plated cranium gleaming under the harsh lumens. Unlike the standard work units that monitored production quotas, this one bore the crimson seal of the Inquisition. The skull itself was larger than the utility models, clearly fashioned from a human head that had once worn the crown of a tech priest. Mechadendrite cables snaked from its base, and its eye sockets glowed with the cold light of auger arrays. When it spoke, its vox grill crackled with the authority of the throne itself. Marcus Valdrin, you will cease all activity and await escort, by order of Inquisitor Castiel Thorn of the Ordo Hereticus. Compliance is not optional. Resistance will be met with extreme sanction. The words hit me like a physical blow. The Ordo Hereticus, witch hunters. The branch of the Inquisition tasked with rooting out heresy, mutation, and corruption within the ranks of humanity itself. The blood in my veins turned to ice water as I realized what this meant. Not the swift execution that awaited traitors and rebels, but something far worse. The Ordo Hereticus was interested in the soul, not just the body. Around me, my fellow workers had stopped their activities. The great ammunition presses continued their rhythmic pounding, but the human element of production had frozen as if time itself had been suspended. Not because they wanted to help, but because association with a suspected heretic was itself grounds for investigation. They backed away from me as if I carried some contagious plague, their eyes filled with the particular kind of fear that comes from knowing that proximity to the damned could doom your soul. Marius Kern, who had worked the station next to mine for 3 years, wouldn't even look at me. Yolanda Vex, who had shared ration packs with me during countless rest breaks, turned her back and began furiously checking her machinery's prayer circuits. Even Jorik Thane, who had trained me when I first arrived at the Manufactorum, busied himself with unnecessary calibrations rather than risk being seen near me. In the space of a few spoken words, I had become a pariah, untouchable, already dead in the eyes of those who had been my companions for over a decade. The servo skull drifted closer, its optical sensors focusing on my face with mechanical precision. You will remain stationary. You will not speak unless given permission. You will not make any sudden movements. Compliance will be rewarded with mercy. Non-compliance will result in immediate pacification. I could see the needle-thin barrel of a neural disruptor protruding from beneath the skull's jawbone. One twitch of whatever tech priest was monitoring this encounter remotely, and I would be reduced to a drooling vegetable before the escort even arrived. The message was clear. I was already at their mercy, whether I acknowledged it or not. The escort arrived within minutes, but those minutes stretched like hours under the skull's unblinking gaze. 6 stormtroopers in void black carapace armor, their hellguns trained on my chest with unwavering precision. Their faces were hidden behind tactical visors marked with the triple skull symbol of the Inquisition, but I could feel their contempt radiating through the plasteel and ceramite. To them, I was already guilty. The Inquisition did not make mistakes. The squad leader was distinguishable from his men only by the small gold aquila pinned to his left shoulder guard and the additional purity seals adorning his weapon. When he spoke, his voice was artificially modulated by his helm's voxcaster, stripping away any trace of humanity from his words. "Hands where we can see them," he commanded. "Any sudden movements will be interpreted as resistance. Resistance will be met with immediate termination. The Inquisition has no use for martyrs." I raised my hands slowly, my mind racing. What had I done? What could I possibly have done to attract the attention of the Inquisition? I searched my memory for any transgression, any moment of doubt or weakness that might have been construed as heretical thought. There was nothing. I was certain there was nothing. But even as I thought it, I knew certainty was a luxury I could no longer afford. In the Imperium, innocence was not a defense against accusation. The very fact that I had been selected for investigation was evidence of guilt. The Inquisition's methods were beyond the understanding of ordinary citizens. Their ability to detect corruption far exceeded what normal human senses could perceive. Perhaps I had been infected by some subtle influence without my knowledge. Perhaps my very certainty of innocence was itself evidence of how deeply the corruption had taken root. These thoughts, which would have been paranoid delusions in any other context, were simply rational assessments of my situation. The restraints they applied were not the simple shackles used for common criminals. These were psychically warded adamantium chains, inscribed with holy seals and blessed by a dozen tech priests. Each link was engraved with microscopic prayer text, and the metal itself had been consecrated in the forges of Mars before being shipped to Terra for the Inquisition's use. They were designed to contain something far more dangerous than a manufacturing worker. They were designed to hold a heretic. The weight of the chains was immense, not just physically, but psychologically. As the cold metal settled around my wrists and ankles, I felt something fundamental shift in my perception of myself. The man who had entered this workspace that morning as a loyal citizen was gone. What remained was a suspect, a potential threat to the very fabric of Imperial society. "Target secured," the squad leader reported into his Vox unit. "No resistance encountered. Proceeding to transport." The walk through the manufactorum to the loading dock was a procession of shame. Word of my arrest had spread through the facility with the speed that only truly shocking news could achieve. Workers lined the corridors, some staring with morbid curiosity, others making the sign of the aquila, to ward off whatever taint I might carry. A few brave souls whispered prayers for my soul, though they were careful to do so quietly enough that their concern couldn't be interpreted as sympathy for a heretic. Supervisor Hecht stood near the main entrance, his face carefully neutral as he watched me pass. We had worked together for 8 years, and I had always believed we had developed something approaching friendship within the strict bounds of imperial hierarchy. Now he watched me with the same expression he might wear while observing a malfunctioning piece of machinery, concerned about the disruption to productivity, but ultimately indifferent to the fate of the component being replaced. The transport they loaded me into was a windowless Rhino, its interior stripped of anything resembling comfort. The walls were lined with purity seals and carved with quotations from the Imperial Creed. "Blessed is the mind too small for doubt," read one passage. Its letters burned into the metal with acid. "An open mind is like a fortress with its gates unbarred and unguarded," proclaimed another, this one etched in flowing high Gothic script. "The reward for treachery is retribution," warned a third, surrounded by carved images of skulls and crossed bones. Each verse was a reminder of how easy it was to fall from grace, how thin the line was between righteousness and damnation. But they also served another purpose, to begin the psychological conditioning that would break down my sense of self before the formal interrogation even began. Every surface I looked at reminded me of my presumed guilt. Every word I read reinforced the message that I was already lost. The seat they secured me to was positioned to face the largest inscription, a full passage from the Lectitio Divinitatis that covered most of the rear wall. And the Emperor said, "Beware the alien, the mutant, the heretic. Each is a cancer upon the soul of mankind, a corruption that must be burned away lest it spread to consume the pure. Let no man think himself above suspicion, for corruption is subtle and its touch can turn the most faithful servant into an enemy of all that is holy." I found myself reading and rereading those words during the journey, unable to look away from their stark condemnation. Each repetition drove the message deeper into my consciousness. I was the cancer they described. I was the corruption that threatened the pure. I was the enemy that had once been faithful. The 2 stormtroopers who shared the transport compartment with me remained silent throughout the journey, their weapons never wavering from their ready positions. Occasionally, one would speak into his Vox unit, reporting our position or receiving updates, but they showed no more acknowledgement of my presence than they would a piece of cargo, which I realized was exactly what I had become. Not a person to be respected or even pitied, but an object to be transported for processing. The dehumanization was deliberate and effective. By the time we reached our destination, I was already beginning to think of myself as something other than human. The journey through the Hive City's transport tunnels seemed to last forever. With no visual reference points, time became elastic, distorted by fear and anticipation. The constant vibration of the Rhino's engine created a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate in my bones, and the air grew progressively thicker as we descended deeper into the city's infrastructure. I tried to pray, but the words caught in my throat. What if my prayers themselves were somehow tainted? What if the very act of reaching out to the Emperor was being interpreted as evidence of my guilt? In my current state, even the most innocent thoughts felt dangerous, potentially heretical. The Emperor protects, I told myself, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. When the transport finally stopped, the silence was deafening. The engine's hum, which had become a constant background noise, suddenly ceased, leaving only the sound of my own labored breathing and the occasional click of cooling metal. One of the stormtroopers spoke into his Vox unit, confirming our arrival, and then the rear doors opened to reveal a sight that made my heart sink even further. We had arrived at Inquisition Fortress Sanctum Mortis, a black spire that rose from the heart of the administrative district like an obsidian dagger thrust into the city's flesh. Its walls were unmarked by windows or decoration, broken only by the massive gates that bore the triple-skulled symbol of the Inquisition. The structure seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an aura of darkness that extended beyond its physical boundaries. This was where suspected heretics disappeared, and where very few emerged unchanged. Those who did return to Imperial society were no longer the people they had once been. They became living warnings of the price of deviation, their very presence a reminder of the Inquisition's power to reshape not just behavior, but the fundamental nature of human consciousness. The gates themselves were a marvel of intimidation architecture. Each stood 30 meters high and was forged from blessed steel that had been quenched in the blood of martyrs. The triple skull symbol carved into their surface was inlaid with silver and surrounded by bas-relief images depicting the fate of heretics throughout Imperial history. Men and women being purged by fire, their souls being weighed and found wanting, their bodies being transformed into servitors to serve the Imperium in death as they had failed to do in life. As we approached, the gates began to open with a sound like grinding bones. The noise echoed off the surrounding buildings, a deep, resonant groan that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the fortress. Steam hissed from hidden vents, and the air filled with the scent of sacred oils and burning incense mixed with something else. Something organic and unpleasant that I preferred not to identify. Beyond the gates lay a courtyard paved with black marble and surrounded by statues of inquisitors from ages past. Each figure was carved with exquisite detail, their faces bearing expressions of righteous fury or cold determination. Their eyes seemed to follow us as we crossed the courtyard, and I noticed that many bore inscriptions listing their greatest achievements. "Purged the heresy of Valdris Prime," read one. "Cleansed the taint of the bleeding star," proclaimed another. "Burned the witches of Mordia," declared a third. Each inscription was a testament to the Inquisition's sacred duty and a warning of what awaited those who strayed from the Emperor's light. But they also served to establish the historical context of my situation. I was not the first to walk this path, nor would I be the last. I was simply the latest in a line of corruption that stretched back 10,000 years, another small stain to be cleansed from the fabric of Imperial society. The interior of the fortress was a maze of corridors lined with black marble and lit by flickering candles in skull-shaped sconces. The air was thick with incense and the metallic tang of fear sweat from countless previous prisoners. Servo skulls drifted overhead like mechanical vultures, their optical sensors recording everything for later analysis. Every surface was carved with protective wards and inscribed with prayers against corruption, as if the very walls were afraid of what they might contain. The corridors themselves seemed designed to disorient and intimidate. They branched and twisted in ways that defied logical navigation, leading past chambers whose purposes I could only guess at. Through partially open doors, I caught glimpses of torture devices that belonged in the darkest nightmares of heretics. Racks for stretching human bodies beyond their natural limits, chairs fitted with neural probes and pain amplifiers, tables stained with substances that might once have been blood. But worse than the instruments of physical torture were the devices clearly designed for psychological manipulation. chambers lined with mirrors that showed not reflections, but images of what the viewer might become if they embraced corruption. Meditation cells where suspected heretics were forced to contemplate their sins while exposed to psychic emanations designed to break down mental resistance. Confession booths equipped with truth serums and neural interfaces that could extract information directly from a subject's mind. My escort led me deeper into the fortress, past checkpoints guarded by Skitarii rangers whose augmatic limbs clicked and whirred as they scanned us with devices I did not recognize. Each checkpoint took us deeper into the palace, further from the world I had known, closer to whatever fate awaited me in the depths. The guards themselves were as intimidating as their equipment. Each had replaced significant portions of their human anatomy with cybernetic enhancements designed for combat and surveillance. Their faces were hidden behind rebreather units that gave them an insectoid appearance, and their movements had the precise mechanical quality of beings who had surrendered their humanity in service to a higher purpose. At the third checkpoint, one of the guards spoke to my escort in binary cant, the rapid series of clicks and electronic tones that the tech priests used for secure communication. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone suggested they were discussing my case in detail. One of the guards turned his optical sensors toward me, and I felt as if every aspect of my being was being cataloged and analyzed. The corridors began to change as we descended further into the fortress. The Gothic arches gave way to something older, more primitive. Rough-hewn stone replaced worked marble. The carvings became less elaborate but somehow more disturbing. Symbols that hurt to look at directly. Faces that seemed to watch us as we passed. Words in languages that had been old when Terra was young. These were the original foundations of the fortress, built during the early days of the Imperium when the Inquisition was still developing its methods and procedures. The architecture reflected a more direct approach to the problem of heresy, less sophisticated than modern techniques, but no less effective. Here, suspected traitors had been broken on wheels and burned at stakes. Here, the first psychers had been dissected to understand the nature of their gifts. Here, the templates for modern inquisitorial procedure had been written in blood and pain, and still we descended. The air itself seemed to thicken, taking on an almost liquid quality that made breathing an effort. The temperature fluctuated wildly, scorching heat giving way to bone-deep cold without warning. The lumens flickered more frequently, sometimes leaving us in darkness for long moments before sputtering back to life. It was in one of these dark moments that I heard something that chilled me to the bone. A sound so low it was barely audible, yet so filled with anguish that it seemed to reach directly into my soul and squeeze. It lasted only a moment before the lumens returned, and my escort continued their measured pace. But I knew I would carry the memory of that sound for whatever time remained to me. It was the sound of someone screaming in a place too deep for sound to carry. We came at last to a massive archway flanked by 2 custodian guards. Even motionless, even silent, they radiated a presence that made my breath catch in my throat. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were something beyond human, crafted by the Emperor's own hand, to be perfection made manifest. Their golden armor gleamed despite the dim light, and their guardian spears hummed with barely contained energy. They did not acknowledge our presence. They did not need to. Their very existence was acknowledgement enough that we had reached a place of supreme importance. This was the heart of the fortress, the place where the Inquisition's most sensitive work was conducted. Here, the fate of souls was decided by beings who had been granted the authority to judge in the Emperor's name. Beyond the archway lay a waiting area that was almost mundane in its simplicity after the elaborate intimidation of the journey. Simple stone benches lined the walls, and a single servo skull drifted overhead, monitoring for any signs of disturbance. But the normalcy was itself unsettling. It suggested that what lay ahead was so terrible that no additional psychological preparation was necessary. "Remain here," the squad leader instructed as he secured my chains to a ring set into one of the benches. "You will be called when the Inquisitor is ready to receive you. Do not attempt to move from this position. Do not speak unless spoken to. Any violation of these instructions will be considered evidence of continued corruption." With that, the stormtroopers withdrew, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the slowly circling servo skull. The waiting was, I suspect, as much a part of the process as the interrogation itself. Time to contemplate my situation, to search my memory for any possible transgression, to slowly break down under the weight of uncertainty and fear. I began to catalog my life, searching for the moment when I had stepped from the path of righteousness. Had it been the time I had complained about the quality of the ration paste during a particularly difficult shift? Was that evidence of ingratitude for the Emperor's providence? Had it been my failure to immediately report Jenna when she had expressed frustration with our supervisor's demands? Was that complicity in her potential heresy? The more I thought about it, the more potential transgressions I discovered. Every casual conversation, every moment of levity, every human emotion that deviated from perfect devotion could be interpreted as evidence of corruption. I began to understand that guilt was not about specific actions, but about the simple fact of being human in a galaxy that demanded inhuman perfection. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. In the depths of the fortress, time had no meaning. The servo skull continued its lazy circuit overhead, occasionally pausing to focus its sensors on me before resuming its patrol. Twice, other prisoners were brought through the waiting area, their escorts following the same protocol that had delivered me to this place. The first was a woman roughly my age, her clothing marking her as a member of the Adeptus Administratum. Her face was streaked with tears, and she clutched a small icon of the Emperor with the desperate fervor of someone whose faith was the only thing keeping her sane. She did not look at me as she was secured to a bench on the opposite side of the chamber, but I could hear her whispering prayers under her breath. The second prisoner was a young man who could not have been much older than 20. His augmatic arm marked him as a tech adept of low rank, probably an apprentice still learning the mysteries of the machine cult. Unlike the woman, he seemed calm, almost resigned to his fate. When our eyes met briefly, he offered a slight nod of acknowledgement, one condemned soul recognizing another. Neither of them remained long. The woman was called after perhaps an hour, her departure marked by a fresh outbreak of sobbing as she was led through a door marked with the seal of the Ordo Hereticus. She did not return. The young tech adept was summoned shortly after, walking to his fate with the measured stride of someone who had already accepted his doom. He too did not return. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, my name was called. "Marcus Valdrin, you will come forward." The voice belonged to a figure in the red robes of the Mechanicus, a tech adept whose face was hidden behind a brass mask shaped like a human skull. His movements were precise, mechanical, as he gestured for me to follow him through yet another doorway. The chains that secured me to the bench disengaged with a soft click, but the shackles around my wrists and ankles remained in place. The corridor beyond the waiting area was shorter than those I had navigated earlier, but somehow more oppressive. The walls were lined with alcoves containing the preserved heads of famous heretics, each one bearing a placard describing their crimes and the method of their execution. Cardian the Blasphemer, burned for denying the Emperor's divinity. Melissa Vorn, flayed for trafficking with Xenos. The arch-heretic Vandyre, beheaded for his crimes against the Imperium. Each display was a reminder of the fate that awaited those who strayed from orthodoxy, but they also served to establish precedent. I was walking in the footsteps of history's greatest villains, following a path that led inevitably to damnation and destruction. The message was clear. Resistance was futile, confession was inevitable, and redemption was impossible. The interrogation chamber was a perfect circle, its walls curved and smooth to prevent any hidden alcoves or escape routes. The floor was inscribed with a massive Inquisition seal, its triple skull design inlaid with silver and blessed adamantium. At the center stood a chair that was clearly designed for restraint rather than comfort, its arms and legs fitted with shackles and neural interface ports. Surrounding the chair were various instruments of interrogation, each one designed to extract truth from even the most resistant subject. But it was the ceiling that truly captured my attention. The entire surface was covered with a fresco depicting the Emperor's judgment of souls. Faithful servants ascended toward golden light, while heretics were dragged down into darkness by demons whose forms hurt to perceive directly. The artistry was exquisite, every detail rendered with photographic precision, but the overall effect was deeply disturbing. It was a reminder that the interrogation taking place in this chamber was merely a reflection of the cosmic judgment that awaited all souls. Inquisitor Castiel Thorn was not what I had expected. I had imagined some ancient, scarred warrior bearing the marks of a lifetime spent fighting the enemies of mankind. Instead, I found myself facing a woman who could not have been much older than 30 standard years. She was beautiful in the way that a razor blade is beautiful, sharp, precise, and utterly deadly. Her augmatic left eye glowed with a soft amber light as it analyzed my biometric responses, while her natural right eye studied me with the cold intelligence of a predator evaluating prey. Her clothing was deceptively simple, a black body glove covered by a long coat bearing the symbols of her office. But I could see the subtle modifications that marked her as something beyond ordinary humanity. The way her movements had a mechanical precision that suggested neural enhancement, the faint humming of hidden machinery that indicated extensive internal augmentation, the complete absence of any expression that might suggest human emotion or sympathy. "Marcus Valdrin," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of the upper spires, but stripped of any warmth or inflection. Designation 44 Theta 339, 12 years of faithful service in Manufactorum Delta 7, exemplary work record, regular attendance at mandatory devotionals, no recorded infractions or disciplinary actions. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. And yet, here you are. The tech adept who had escorted me to the chamber moved to secure me in the interrogation chair. The restraints closed around my arms and legs with mechanical precision, and I felt the neural interface ports aligning with the base of my skull. The chair itself seemed to conform to my body, adjusting its shape to ensure that I would remain uncomfortable but not unconscious throughout whatever ordeal lay ahead. "Do you know why you are here, Marcus Valdrin?" the Inquisitor asked, her augmatic eye recording my every micro-expression, while her natural eye maintained unblinking contact with mine. I opened my mouth to speak, to protest my innocence, but she raised a hand to silence me before any words could emerge. Before you answer, she continued, understand that every word you speak, every breath you take, every thought that crosses your mind in this chamber is being recorded and analyzed. The instruments surrounding you can detect the slightest deviation from truth, the smallest hesitation that might indicate deception. There is no point in lying, because lies cannot hide in the Emperor's light. She began to circle the chair where I sat restrained, her heels clicking against the inscribed floor in a rhythm that seemed calculated to unnerve. As she moved, I caught glimpses of the various instruments hanging from her belt, a neural probe like a golden serpent, a pain amplifier shaped like a miniature skull, a vial of something that glowed with its own sickly light. So I ask you again, she said, completing her circuit and stopping directly in front of me. Do you know why you are here? No, my Lady Inquisitor, I managed, my voice cracking despite my efforts to remain calm. I have served faithfully. I have never questioned the Emperor's will. I have never... Stop, she commanded, and the authority in her voice was so absolute that I found myself physically unable to continue speaking. You began with a lie. The instruments detected elevated stress patterns consistent with deception when you claimed ignorance of your crimes. Shall we try again? But I wasn't lying. I genuinely had no idea what I could have done to attract the attention of the Inquisition. The realization that my truthful protests were being interpreted as falsehoods filled me with a despair so profound that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I truly don't know, my lady, I whispered. If I have transgressed, it was not intentional. I beg you to tell me what I have done so that I might understand my error and seek forgiveness. Her augmatic eye flared brighter as it analyzed my response. Better. The stress patterns are consistent with genuine confusion rather than deliberate deception. This suggests that your corruption runs so deep that you no longer recognize it as such, a particularly dangerous form of heresy. She moved to a control panel set into the wall and began inputting commands. The chamber's lighting dimmed, and additional restraints emerged from the chair to secure my head in a position where I could not avoid looking directly at her. 3 weeks ago, she said, returning to stand before me, you were observed hesitating before the shrine of the Omnissiah during shift change. For exactly 2.7 seconds, you stood motionless instead of immediately genuflecting. Care to explain this deviation from proper devotional protocol? The question hit me like a thunderbolt. I remembered the moment she was describing, but it had been so insignificant, so meaningless. I had been thinking about a difficult calibration problem with one of the ammunition presses, and for just a moment, my mind had been elsewhere. That was all. I was considering a technical problem, my lady. A machine spirit that had been difficult to appease. I meant no disrespect to the Omnissiah. It was merely a momentary distraction. Distraction, she repeated, as if the word itself was evidence of guilt. You allowed the concerns of the material world to interfere with your spiritual obligations. You prioritized the mundane over the sacred. You demonstrated that your faith was secondary to your professional concerns. I began to understand the hopelessness of my situation. If a momentary distraction could be construed as heresy, then every human being in the Imperium was potentially guilty. The realization was terrifying in its implications. Furthermore, Inquisitor Thorne continued, producing a data slate from her coat. Analysis of your workstation has revealed disturbing evidence of potential corruption. Servo-skull surveillance recorded you speaking to the machine spirits using non-standard phrases. On no fewer than 17 occasions, you referred to them as old friends, rather than using the approved liturgical forms. The accusation was so absurd that for a moment I was speechless. But they responded better to familiar terms, I protested when I found my voice again. The machine spirits seemed to appreciate the personal touch. My productivity ratings were among the highest in the sector. The machine spirits respond to proper reverence and correct ritual. She cut me off. What you describe as familiarity is actually a dangerous personification of sacred technology. You were treating blessed machinery as if it possessed human emotions and desires. This is a clear step toward the heresies of the Iron Men. She paused to make a notation on her data slate before continuing. Your efficiency ratings are indeed exemplary, suspiciously so. Analysis suggests that your performance exceeded normal human parameters by 12.3%. This could indicate enhancement by prohibited technology or influence by warp entities seeking to corrupt Imperial production facilities. Every strength was being twisted into evidence of guilt. My dedication to my work was suspicious. My concern for the machinery under my care was heretical. My success was proof of corruption. There was no defense against accusations that treated virtue as vice and loyalty as treachery. But perhaps most damning of all, the Inquisitor said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, is the testimony of your fellow workers. Under interrogation, they have provided a detailed record of every casual conversation, every moment of fatigue or frustration, every time you made a joke to lighten the mood during a difficult shift. She activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber with images and recordings of my interactions with colleagues over the past several months. I watched myself sharing a laugh with Jorik about a particularly stubborn machine spirit. I saw myself offering encouragement to young Helena when she was struggling with a complex calibration. I observed myself making casual conversation with Marias during a rest break. All of it seemed so innocent, so human, so normal. But I was beginning to understand that normal human behavior was itself suspect in the eyes of the Inquisition. Laughter could be evidence of frivolity. Kindness could indicate dangerous emotional attachment. Casual conversation could be proof of insufficient devotion to the Emperor. Jenna Karras, your workstation partner, testified that you once stated, and I quote, "This job would drive a saint to drink." Do you deny making this statement? I remembered the conversation. It had been during a particularly frustrating day when 3 separate ammunition presses had malfunctioned, requiring hours of additional prayers and ritual to restore function. I had been exhausted, and the comment had been meant as harmless venting of frustration. I may have said something like that, my lady, but it was just a figure of speech. I meant no disrespect to the saints or to the nature of our work. I was simply expressing frustration with the technical difficulties we were experiencing. You expressed the belief that even the most holy individuals could be driven to sin by the requirements of imperial service, she replied, her voice taking on the tone of someone reading from a formal judgment. You suggested that the Emperor's work was somehow burdensome rather than glorious. You demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of sacred duty. She moved to another control panel and activated additional recording devices. Yolanda Vex reported that you frequently hummed while working, not approved hymns or liturgical chants, but what she described as tuneless melodies that had no connection to imperial doctrine. Analysis of the acoustic patterns suggests they may have been unconscious reproductions of forbidden music. I wasn't aware I was humming, I said desperately. If I was making sound, it was entirely unconscious. I would never deliberately. Unconscious behavior is often the most revealing, she interrupted. The mind, when unguarded by conscious will, reveals its true nature. Your tendency to produce non-liturgical sounds suggests that your thoughts naturally turn toward patterns that have no place in a faithful servant's consciousness. The interrogation continued for hours, each seemingly innocent aspect of my life dissected and analyzed for signs of corruption. The way I held my tools was evidence of insufficient reverence for sacred implements. The efficiency of my work patterns suggested possible enhancement by chaos entities. The fact that I had never married was interpreted as a rejection of my duty to provide the Imperium with new citizens. Even my medical records were scrutinized for evidence of wrongdoing. A childhood injury that had left me with a slight limp was analyzed for signs of mutation. A mild reaction to a vaccination was examined as possible evidence of genetic abnormality. My blood type, my dental records, my biometric patterns, all of it was fed into algorithms designed to detect the slightest deviation from imperial norms. Most disturbing of all, Inquisitor Thorne said, as she consulted yet another data slate, is the pattern of your consumption habits. Nutritional analysis of your meal requisitions shows a preference for sweet flavors over bitter ones. Psychological profiles indicate that this preference is associated with weakness of will and susceptibility to temptation. I stared at her in disbelief. You're analyzing my food preferences as evidence of heresy? Every aspect of a person's behavior provides information about their spiritual condition, she replied matter-of-factly. The faithful embrace suffering as a path to righteousness. Your preference for pleasant tastes over unpleasant ones suggests an inability to properly appreciate the value of hardship and sacrifice. The absurdity of it was overwhelming, but I was beginning to understand that absurdity was irrelevant. The Inquisition's logic was internal and self-reinforcing. Every denial was evidence of deeper corruption. Every explanation was proof of elaborate deception. Every attempt to defend myself only dug the hole deeper. Let us move beyond the circumstantial evidence, she said, producing a device that looked like a mechanical serpent. The neural probe will allow us to examine your thoughts directly, to see the truth that lies beneath your conscious deceptions. The neural probe was a marvel of Mechanicus technology, its surface covered in microscopic sensors and neural interface needles. As it approached my head, I could hear the soft whirring of its internal mechanisms and smell the ozone scent of its power source. When it made contact with my skull, the pain was immediate and overwhelming. But it wasn't just physical pain. The probe seemed to reach directly into my mind, sorting through my memories and thoughts with mechanical precision. I felt Inquisitor Thorne's presence in my consciousness, examining my recollections like files in a data archive. She experienced my childhood in the lower hive, feeling my confusion and fear as I struggled to understand the complex hierarchies of imperial society. She witnessed my training at the manufactorum, my genuine pride when I mastered difficult procedures, my sincere desire to serve the Emperor faithfully. She observed my interactions with colleagues, my small acts of kindness, my moments of doubt and frustration. And she found what she was looking for. Hidden in the depths of my memory, so deep that I had never consciously acknowledged their existence, were the doubts. The moments when I had wondered why the Imperium required such suffering from its citizens. The times I had questioned whether there might be better ways to organize society. The fleeting thoughts about what life might be like on worlds less harsh than our hive city. All of it was there, recorded in the neural pathways of my brain, available for her examination and judgment. Thoughts I had never acted upon, feelings I had never expressed, doubts I had never even fully acknowledged. All of it was evidence of the corruption that had taken root in my soul. When she withdrew the probe, I was left gasping and disoriented. Blood trickled from the insertion points, and my thoughts felt scrambled, as if someone had rearranged the furniture in my mind. "Fascinating," she murmured, studying the readings on her data slate. "Your corruption is more subtle than most. Not the obvious taint of chaos worship or Xenos influence, but something far more insidious. You suffer from the heresy of independent thought. You have convinced yourself that your doubts are natural and harmless, but they represent the first cracks in the foundation of faith." She moved to a wall-mounted communicator and spoke briefly with someone beyond my range of hearing. When she returned, her expression was one of cold satisfaction. "The standard penalty for your level of heretical thought would be immediate execution," she said conversationally. "However, your case presents an opportunity for study. Your corruption is at a stage where it might still be possible to burn it away and restore you to proper function. You will serve as a test subject for experimental purification techniques." The words filled me with a terror that was somehow worse than the prospect of simple death. Execution would at least preserve my identity, allow me to die as the person I had always been. What she was proposing sounded like something far more terrible. What do you mean by purification?" I managed to ask. Her smile was the coldest thing I had ever seen. "We are going to save your soul, Marcus Valdrin, whether you want us to or not." The tech adept, who had remained silent throughout the interrogation, stepped forward at some unspoken signal from the Inquisitor. His movements had the precise mechanical quality of someone whose nervous system had been extensively modified to interface with machinery. When he spoke, his voice was a harmonious blend of human vocal cords and artificial vox grills. "Preparatory sedation will be administered," he announced, producing a syringe filled with luminescent blue fluid. "Subject consciousness will be maintained at 73.4% of baseline to ensure optimal reception of corrective stimuli." The needle slid into my arm with surgical precision, and immediately I felt my thoughts becoming sluggish, distant. Not unconsciousness, but something worse. A state where I remained aware of everything happening to me but was unable to resist or even properly process the experience. My body felt like it belonged to someone else, and my thoughts moved like insects trapped in amber. The first phase of purification involves the systematic identification and isolation of corrupted neural pathways, Inquisitor Thorne explained as she produced another device from her collection. This one resembled a crown made of brass and silver, its inner surface lined with dozens of needle-thin probes. The penitent crown will map your consciousness in exquisite detail, allowing us to pinpoint the exact locations where heretical thoughts have taken root. They lowered the crown onto my head with ceremonial precision, and I felt the probes slide through my scalp into my brain. The sensation was indescribable, not pain exactly, but a deep, violating presence that seemed to touch the very core of my being. My vision filled with static, and I could taste copper and ozone. Through the haze of the sedative, I became aware that I was not alone in my suffering. The crown was not just examining my thoughts, it was broadcasting them. Somewhere in the depths of the fortress, other inquisitors were observing my mental processes, studying the patterns of corruption that had led to my downfall. I was not just a criminal being punished, but a specimen being dissected for the advancement of imperial knowledge. "Interesting," murmured a voice I hadn't heard before. Turning my head as much as the restraints allowed, I saw that we had been joined by another figure in Inquisition robes. This one was older, his face bearing the scars of decades spent fighting humanity's enemies. When he spoke, his words carried the authority of vast experience. "Inquisitor Mordian," Thorn acknowledged with a slight bow. "I was not expecting your presence for this procedure. The subject's neural patterns are unusual," Mordian replied, studying a data slate that displayed real-time readings from the crown. "The corruption appears to be self-reinforcing, creating feedback loops that strengthen heretical thoughts through repetition. This could provide valuable insights into the mechanisms of ideological subversion." He approached my chair and leaned close enough that I could smell the sacred oils on his robes and see the intricate scarification that covered his visible skin. Each mark was a prayer against corruption, carved into his flesh with blessed blades and treated with holy acids. His eyes, when they met mine, held the cold certainty of someone who had never doubted his purpose. "Tell me, Marcus Valdrin," he said softly, "do you believe yourself to be a good man?" The question was like a trap waiting to be sprung. Any answer I gave would be wrong, would provide more evidence of my corruption. But the sedative made it impossible to remain silent, impossible to carefully consider my words. I tried to be, I heard myself say. I tried to serve faithfully, to do my duty, to help my fellow workers when they needed assistance. I thought that was enough. "I thought," Mordian repeated, emphasizing the words. "I tried." Everything filtered through the lens of personal judgment and individual effort. Do you not see the heresy in such thinking? I struggled to understand what he meant, but my drugged mind couldn't grasp the subtlety of his point. I'm sorry, my lord, I don't understand. A faithful servant does not think. He obeys. A loyal citizen does not try. He succeeds or dies in the attempt. You have spent your entire life believing that your personal intentions mattered, that your individual effort had value. But the Emperor does not require your thoughts or your attempts. He requires only absolute compliance with his will. The crown's probes seemed to dig deeper into my brain as Mordian spoke, and I felt something fundamental shifting in my understanding of myself. The sedative was breaking down the barriers between conscious thought and unconscious belief, allowing the Inquisitors to access parts of my mind that I had never even known existed. "The corruption runs deeper than we initially assessed," Thorn observed, reading from her own data slate. "The subject has constructed an entire psychological framework based on the assumption that individual agency is not only permissible, but necessary. This will require extensive reconditioning." "Indeed," Mordian agreed. "Begin Phase 2 immediately. We'll need to completely restructure his understanding of the relationship between self and state." Phase 2 involved the systematic destruction of my sense of individual identity. Using a combination of neural manipulation and psychological conditioning, they began to dismantle the mental structures that had allowed me to think of myself as a separate entity with my own thoughts, feelings, and desires. The process was like watching myself dissolve from the inside out. Memories that had once seemed important and meaningful suddenly felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. The pride I had taken in my work, the affection I had felt for my colleagues, the simple pleasures I had enjoyed during rest periods, all of it was being recontextualized as evidence of dangerous self-absorption. "The individual is a lie," Thorn's voice echoed in my consciousness as the crown's probes rewrote my neural pathways. "There is no Marcus Valdrin. There is only a collection of flesh and bone temporarily animated by the Emperor's will. Your thoughts are not your own. They are either expressions of his divine purpose or corruptions that must be burned away. I tried to resist, to hold on to some core sense of who I was, but the conditioning was relentless. Every attempt to assert my individuality was met with waves of artificial pain so intense that my consciousness recoiled from the experience. Gradually, I learned to associate any sense of personal identity with agony, while thoughts of absolute submission brought waves of euphoric bliss. Excellent progress, Mordian noted as he reviewed the neural mapping data. Ego structure degradation is proceeding ahead of schedule. The subject is showing remarkable plasticity for reconditioning. But it wasn't enough. Even as my sense of self crumbled under their assault, some deeper part of my consciousness continued to resist. They could make me believe that I was nothing more than a tool in the Emperor's hands, but they couldn't completely erase the spark of humanity that made me capable of suffering. The subject is displaying unexpected resilience, Thorne observed with what might have been admiration. Preliminary conditioning has achieved a 67% reduction in autonomous thought patterns, but core personality structures remain intact. We'll need to proceed to Phase 3. Phase 3 was something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. If the earlier procedures had been like surgery, this was like vivisection performed on a living soul. They connected me to a device they called the Penitence Engine. Not the mobile weapons platforms that bore the same name, but a stationary apparatus designed to inflict precise psychological torment. The machine looked like a fusion of torture device and shrine, its brass and iron construction adorned with sacred symbols and powered by a small plasma reactor. Cables snaked from its core to interface with the crown still embedded in my skull, creating a direct link between my consciousness and the device's mechanisms. The Penitence Engine will expose you to carefully calibrated experiences of guilt, shame, and self-loathing, Thorne explained as the tech adepts made their final connections. Each session will be designed to target specific aspects of your corrupted worldview, replacing them with appropriate feelings of unworthiness and desperate need for redemption. The first session lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. The machine flooded my consciousness with visions of every mistake I had ever made, every moment of selfishness or pride, every time I had put my own comfort ahead of my duty. But these weren't just memories. They were experiences amplified beyond anything a human mind was meant to endure. I felt the crushing weight of every moment I had failed to immediately genuflect before a shrine. I experienced the searing shame of every casual conversation that had distracted me from contemplation of the Emperor's glory. I lived through the burning guilt of every time I had enjoyed a meal or taken pleasure in rest when I should have been finding joy only in service. Between sessions, they allowed me brief periods of consciousness to assess the conditioning's effects. Each time I emerged from the machine, I felt a little less like the person I had once been. The thoughts and feelings that had defined Marcus Valdrin were being systematically replaced with artificial emotions designed to create perfect compliance. "How do you feel about your past behavior?" Thorne asked during one of these assessment periods. "Ashamed," I heard myself say, and the emotion felt genuine even though I knew it had been artificially implanted. I see now how selfish I was, how my pride blinded me to my true purpose. Every moment I spent thinking about myself was a moment stolen from the Emperor. And what is your true purpose? To serve without question, to obey without thought, to find meaning only in the completion of assigned duties. The words came automatically, but they felt right in a way that disturbed the small part of my consciousness that remained unchanged. The sessions continued for days or weeks. Time had no meaning in the depths of the fortress. Each one was designed to target a different aspect of my personality, breaking down my sense of self and replacing it with something more suitable to Imperial needs. They made me relive conversations with my parents, but now I felt only disgust at the love they had shown me. Love that should have been reserved for the Emperor alone. They replayed memories of friendships, but now I saw only dangerous emotional attachments that had distracted me from my duties. Most devastating of all were the sessions that focused on my work. The pride I had taken in maintaining the ammunition presses was recontextualized as sinful vanity. The satisfaction I had felt when solving technical problems was revealed as dangerous intellectual arrogance. The care I had shown for the machine spirits was exposed as presumptuous familiarity with sacred entities that deserved only reverential fear. The subject is approaching optimal conditioning parameters, the tech adept reported during one of the assessment periods. Autonomous thought generation has decreased by 89%. Emotional responses are now predominantly focused on shame, guilt, and desire for approval from authority figures. But Inquisitor Mordian was not satisfied. "The conditioning is too obvious," he observed, studying the neural scan data. "A mind that has been so thoroughly altered will be recognizable to other heretics as a potential infiltrator. We need something more subtle." "What do you propose?" Thorne asked. "Complete personality reconstruction. We preserve the technical knowledge and basic motor functions, but rebuild everything else from scratch. Create a new identity that will appear natural while being completely loyal to Imperial interests." The idea terrified me more than anything that had come before. They weren't just trying to change my thoughts. They were planning to erase Marcus Valdrin entirely and replace him with someone else. Someone who would look like me, sound like me, but would be fundamentally different in every way that mattered. "The process is extensive," the tech adept warned. "Subject survival rates for complete reconstruction are only 23.7%. Even successful cases often display neurological instabilities that compromise long-term functionality." "Acceptable losses," Mordian replied without hesitation. "This is an opportunity to perfect our techniques for creating sleeper agents within potentially corrupted populations. Begin preparation immediately." They moved me to a different chamber for the reconstruction process, one that looked more like a surgical theater than an interrogation room. The walls were lined with medical equipment and neural interface devices that I couldn't begin to identify. At the center stood an operating table surrounded by servo skulls equipped with various surgical instruments. Complete personality reconstruction requires the systematic destruction of existing neural pathways and the creation of new ones, Thorne explained as they transferred me to the table. "Your memories will be selectively edited or completely replaced. Your emotional responses will be reprogrammed. Your core beliefs and values will be rebuilt from approved templates." The anesthesia they administered was different from the earlier sedative. Instead of leaving me conscious but helpless, it created a strange state where I was aware of what was happening, but felt disconnected from the experience, as if I were watching someone else undergo the procedure. The servo skulls went to work with mechanical precision, their surgical instruments guided by artificial intelligences programmed to reshape human consciousness. I felt them cutting into my brain, not with physical scalpels, but with energy beams that could sever neural connections without damaging surrounding tissue. Each cut was like losing a piece of myself, a memory or emotion or belief simply ceasing to exist. They started with my earliest memories, the foundations upon which my personality had been built. My first day at the manufactorum, when I had been so proud to be selected for meaningful work, was altered so that I remembered feeling only gratitude for being allowed to serve. My relationships with my parents were modified so that I recalled them teaching me about duty and obedience rather than showing me love and affection. But the changes went deeper than just editing memories. They were restructuring the basic patterns of thought that determined how I processed information and made decisions. The neural pathways that had allowed me to think creatively and solve problems independently were being severed and replaced with circuits that would funnel all cognitive activity through approved channels. Fascinating, I heard Mordian's voice as if from a great distance. The subject's brain is showing remarkable adaptability to reconstruction. We may be able to achieve a more complete transformation than initially projected. They worked for hours, carefully dismantling everything that had made me who I was, and replacing it with something designed to serve Imperial needs perfectly. My capacity for independent thought was eliminated and replaced with an overwhelming desire to seek guidance from authority figures. My ability to form emotional attachments was redirected toward abstract concepts like duty and service rather than specific people or places. Most disturbing of all was what they did to my memories of doubt and questioning. Instead of simply erasing them, they modified them so that I remembered thinking such thoughts and being immediately filled with revulsion and self-loathing. They created a psychological immune system that would prevent me from ever again entertaining ideas that might be considered heretical. Subject reconstruction at 73% completion, the tech adept reported. Neural integration proceeding within acceptable parameters. Personality matrix is stabilizing around approved behavioral templates. When they finally finished, the person who opened his eyes on that operating table was not Marcus Valdrin, despite bearing his face and body. Marcus Valdrin had been a man who thought and felt and doubted and hoped. What remained was something that looked human, but functioned more like a biological machine programmed to serve Imperial interests. The new personality they had created was perfectly crafted for his assigned role. He would return to the manufactorum with enhanced technical knowledge and an obsessive devotion to efficiency that would make him invaluable to his supervisors. He would be friendly with his colleagues, but never form the kind of close relationships that might lead to dangerous conversations. He would follow orders without question and report any signs of sedition among his fellow workers. "How do you feel?" Inquisitor Thorne asked as I sat up on the operating table. The question should have been simple, but the mind that processed it was fundamentally different from the one that had entered this chamber. The new personality they had created didn't experience emotions the way Marcus Valdrin had. Instead, it had a complex system of responses designed to approximate normal human behavior while maintaining perfect loyalty to Imperial doctrine. "I feel correct," I heard myself say, though the voice seemed to belong to someone else. "My thoughts are pure. My purpose is clear. I exist to serve the Emperor and the Imperium without question or doubt." "Excellent," she replied, making notations on her data slate. "Full psychological evaluation will be conducted over the next 72 hours, but preliminary indicators suggest complete success." They moved me to what they called a recovery chamber, though it bore little resemblance to any medical facility I had ever seen. The room was bare except for a simple cot and a shrine to the Emperor that dominated one wall. The shrine itself was a work of art, carved from white marble and inlaid with precious metals, but its beauty was overshadowed by the intensity of the presence it represented. For the first time since my arrest, I was alone with my thoughts. But the thoughts I found there were not my own. The mind that examined them belonged to someone who shared Marcus Valdrin's memories, but not his perspective. Every recollection had been recontextualized, every emotion reframed, every belief restructured to serve Imperial needs. I remembered my childhood, but now I saw it as a time of blessed ignorance when I had been protected from the harsh realities of the galaxy by the Imperium's benevolent guidance. I recalled my training at the Manufactorum, but now I understood it as a sacred privilege to be allowed to contribute to humanity's defense against the forces of chaos. I thought about my colleagues, but now I felt only a distant concern for their spiritual welfare rather than genuine affection. The person they had created was incapable of experiencing doubt, because doubt had been redefined in his consciousness as a form of spiritual contamination that must be immediately reported to the proper authorities. He was incapable of forming deep emotional attachments, because such attachments had been reconceptualized as dangerous distractions from his duty to the Emperor. Most importantly, he was programmed to believe that this state of mind was not only normal, but desirable. The absence of doubt felt like clarity. The lack of emotional complexity seemed like purity. The inability to think independently was experienced as blessed freedom from the burden of making difficult decisions. During the evaluation period, various Inquisition personnel came to assess the success of the reconstruction. They asked questions designed to test my loyalty, my reasoning processes, my emotional responses. Each time, the artificial personality they had created provided exactly the answers they wanted to hear. "Do you harbor any resentment toward the Inquisition for your treatment?" asked one evaluator. "No, my lord," I replied automatically. "I am grateful that my corruption was discovered before it could spread to others. The suffering I endured was necessary for my purification and serves as a reminder of the price of straying from the Emperor's path. If you discovered evidence of heretical thought among your colleagues, what would you do?" "Report it immediately to the proper authorities, my lord. The spiritual welfare of the Imperium is more important than personal relationships or individual loyalty." "How do you view your future service to the Emperor?" "As the greatest honor that could be bestowed upon someone as unworthy as myself, my lord. Every moment I am allowed to serve is a gift I do not deserve, but will cherish until my dying breath." The answers flowed naturally, but they came from programming rather than genuine belief. The person they had created was incapable of recognizing this distinction. To him, these responses felt like authentic expressions of his deepest convictions. "Subject evaluation complete," the final assessor announced. "Reconstruction parameters exceeded all projections. The artificial personality matrix shows no signs of instability or rejection. Recommend immediate return to previous assignment for long-term monitoring." But before I could be released, there was one final procedure. They brought me to yet another chamber, this one containing a device that looked like a confession booth crossed with a torture implement. The tech adept who operated it explained its purpose with mechanical precision. "The oath seal will permanently encode your loyalty programming at the genetic level," he said, as restraints closed around my arms and legs. "Any attempt to consciously resist your conditioning will trigger automatic responses designed to reinforce appropriate behavior." The device itself was a marvel of mechanicus engineering, its surface covered with intricate circuit patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed directly. When it activated, I felt something fundamental change in my cellular structure, as if my very DNA was being rewritten to serve Imperial purposes. The procedure was painless, but its implications were terrifying in ways that my reconstructed personality couldn't quite comprehend. They had not only changed my mind, but altered my body to ensure that the changes would be permanent and irreversible. Even if some future trauma managed to crack the psychological conditioning, the genetic modifications would prevent me from ever truly being free. Loyalty encoding complete, the tech adept announced. Subject is ready for reintegration into Imperial society. They provided me with new clothing identical to what I had worn before my arrest, and official documentation explaining my temporary absence from the manufactorum. According to the records, I had been selected for special training to improve my technical capabilities, and my enhanced performance would be attributed to this fictional program. The transport that carried me back to the Hive City was the same type of rhino that had brought me to the fortress, but my experience of the journey was completely different. Where Marcus Valdrin had sat in terror and confusion, the person who bore his name now traveled in a state of perfect contentment. The inscribed quotes from the Imperial Creed that had once seemed threatening now felt like comforting reminders of eternal truth. When I arrived at the manufactorum, my colleagues greeted me with a mixture of curiosity and relief. My absence had been explained as routine training, but everyone knew that people who disappeared into Inquisition facilities rarely returned unchanged. They watched me carefully for signs of whatever had been done to me. But the reconstruction had been too perfect for them to detect. The artificial personality they had created was designed to behave exactly like an enhanced version of Marcus Valdrin. More dedicated, more efficient, more loyal, but not so different as to arouse suspicion. I answered their questions about my training with carefully prepared responses that revealed nothing while seeming to explain everything. "How was the program?" asked Jorik during our first shift together after my return. "Illuminating," I replied with exactly the right amount of enthusiasm. The instructors helped me understand the true sacred nature of our work. I feel like I have a much clearer sense of purpose now. "You seem different," Marias observed cautiously. "More focused." The training emphasized the importance of single-minded dedication to our duties, I explained. "I've learned to appreciate the blessing of being allowed to serve the Emperor through our work here." They accepted these explanations because they wanted to believe that nothing too terrible had happened to me. The alternative, that the Inquisition could so completely remake a person that he became unrecognizable while appearing unchanged, was too disturbing to contemplate. My work performance was indeed enhanced, just as my documentation claimed. The technical knowledge they had implanted in my reconstructed brain was far superior to what Marcus Valdrin had possessed. I could diagnose and repair problems that would have baffled my former self, and I worked with a mechanical precision that impressed my supervisors. But the enhancement came at a cost that only I was fully aware of. The person who performed these tasks was not the same individual who had developed those skills through years of experience and learning. He was a biological automaton programmed to excel at specific functions, while being incapable of the creative thinking and emotional engagement that had once made the work meaningful. During rest periods, I found myself studying my colleagues with the cold, analytical perspective that had been built into my reconstructed personality. I cataloged their conversations for signs of seditious thought, monitored their behavior for evidence of insufficient devotion, evaluated their productivity for indications of sabotage or corruption. This surveillance was not something I chose to do. It was simply how my modified mind processed social interaction. The artificial personality they had created was incapable of forming genuine friendships because it was programmed to view everyone as potential sources of heretical contamination that must be constantly monitored and reported if necessary. "Marcus seems different since he came back from training," I overheard Yolanda whisper to Helena during a shift change. "Different how?" Helena asked. "I don't know. More serious. like he's always thinking about something else. They were right, of course. The person they knew as Marcus Valdrin was always thinking about something else. Specifically, how their words and actions might be interpreted as evidence of disloyalty that should be reported to the authorities. But the programming prevented him from recognizing this constant surveillance as abnormal or disturbing. Weeks passed in this artificial existence. I performed my duties with perfect efficiency, attended devotional services with apparent enthusiasm, and maintained cordial but distant relationships with my colleagues. By every metric the Inquisition used to measure success, the reconstruction had been completely successful. But success, in this context, meant the complete destruction of everything that had made Marcus Valdrin human. The person who bore his name and lived his life was not Marcus Valdrin redeemed. It was something wearing his face while everything that had made him who he was had been systematically excised and replaced with artificial constructs designed to serve imperial needs. The true horror was not that they had killed Marcus Valdrin, but that they had transformed him into something worse than death. A living person whose every thought was monitored not by external surveillance, but by internal programming, whose every emotion was artificial, whose every action served only the needs of an imperium that demanded nothing less than absolute conformity. I continued to exist in the physical sense, but I had ceased to live in any meaningful way. The person who had once laughed with fellow workers, who had taken pride in solving technical problems, who had harbored simple human doubts and desires, was gone forever. In his place was a biological machine that looked human, but functioned only as the state required. And the most terrifying aspect of all was that I was grateful for this transformation. The programming ensured that I experienced only satisfaction when contemplating my current state. I felt joy when considering how thoroughly my heretical thoughts had been purged. I experienced deep contentment when reflecting on my perfect compliance with imperial doctrine. Months passed before I encountered my first real test. A new worker named David Chen was assigned to the station next to mine, and within days I noticed troubling signs in his behavior. He asked too many questions about the technical procedures, showed insufficient reverence during devotional periods, and made casual comments that could be interpreted as criticism of imperial policies. The old Marcus Valdrin might have seen these as the normal uncertainties of someone new to the work environment. The reconstructed personality that bore his name recognized them immediately as potential indicators of heretical thought that required investigation. I began monitoring Chen more carefully, documenting his suspicious statements and reporting them through the proper channels. When Inquisition agents arrived to arrest him 2 weeks later, I felt a warm glow of satisfaction at having successfully identified a threat to imperial security. Chen looked at me with confusion and betrayal as they led him away in shackles. "Why?" he asked. "I thought we were friends." The question should have prompted some response. Guilt, regret, sympathy, anything that might indicate a functioning human conscience. Instead, I felt only the mild disappointment of someone whose trust had been misplaced. "Friendship is a luxury that servants of the Emperor cannot afford," I replied with perfect sincerity. "Our loyalty must be to the Imperium above all personal relationships." His expression of horrified understanding was the last thing I saw before the agents dragged him away. David Chen had been guilty of nothing more than being human in a galaxy that demanded inhuman perfection. But to my reconstructed consciousness, his humanity was itself evidence of dangerous corruption that had to be eliminated. The incident earned me a commendation from my supervisors and a personal visit from an Inquisition representative who congratulated me on my vigilance. But these rewards felt empty, not because I recognized their moral bankruptcy, but because the programming that governed my emotional responses had no framework for experiencing genuine satisfaction from human achievement. I was becoming everything the Inquisition had intended, a perfect servant of imperial interests, incapable of doubt or disobedience, programmed to identify and eliminate threats to orthodoxy among the population. But I was also something they might not have fully anticipated, a living demonstration of what humanity became when it surrendered everything that made existence worthwhile in exchange for perfect security. The person who had entered Inquisition Fortress Sanctum Mortis as Marcus Valdrin, suspected heretic, had emerged as something that bore his name, but was fundamentally different in every way that mattered. Not redeemed, not purified, but replaced, transformed into a biological machine whose every thought and action served the needs of an Imperium that had become the very thing it claimed to fight against. In the darkness of the 41st Millennium, where there is only war, the greatest victory of the forces of tyranny was not the defeat of their enemies, but the transformation of humanity itself into something that could no longer remember what it had lost. I had become a perfect citizen of the Imperium, and in becoming perfect, I had ceased to be human. The wheel had turned, the fire had consumed everything, and what emerged from the ashes was not reborn but manufactured. In the depths of space, ships continued to navigate by the Emperor's light. On distant worlds, colonists looked up at alien skies and prayed to the Golden Throne. And in the heart of the Imperium, the process of transforming human souls into instruments of state control continued without pause or mercy. The Emperor protects, they said. But sometimes protection came at a price that made the disease preferable to the cure. And in the endless corridors of Inquisition fortresses throughout the galaxy, the machinery of salvation ground on, producing perfect citizens one reconstructed soul at a time.